Hello all, today I'm making another Battlefield chessboard. Because woodworking is mostly a hobby, I'm pretty bad at pricing my products, or pretty good if you're a customer. The Battlefield chessboards are fairly expensive right now at about $550, but I do put in a lot of time and the cost of materials is also pretty high. So this time I decided to roughly track my time and the cost of materials to find out how much I'm undercharging. During this build though, there was a lot of time spent on resolving mistakes, mostly in the form of remaking chess pieces. I didn't count the time spent on resolving these issues because I wanted a time and cost estimate of the best case scenario. The first several steps of preparing the walnut and maple for the first glue up took a little over an hour. This includes cutting the lumber to a rough length of about 20 inches, cutting the edges of each board to be straight and parallel, cutting out the first set of strips to be about 2¼ inches, and finally running those strips on edge through the planer to their final thickness. The cost of the wood just for the board and pieces, so not including the veneer on the underside or the 1/4 inch material that makes up the frame, was about $125. This was about 3 board feet of each material and included some excess in case I needed to remake some pieces, which I did. Also, the walnut board had some checking that ate up the first 2 to 3 inches of the board, so that kind of sucked. The first glue up is nice and easy for the most part and took less than 30 minutes. Prior to cutting the second set of strips though, I needed to flatten the board and glue on some sacrificial pieces for when the second set of strips gets run through the planer. That process took about an hour. Now is probably a good time to mention that during this build, my GoPro crapped out on me. I won't go into the details of what the issue was just because it's boring, but I'll say that the customer support wasn't satisfactory, so I switched to a DJI camera. However, I'm bringing it up now because some things didn't get recorded. I know that I set up the GoPro to record cutting the second set of strips, but the video doesn't exist, so I guess that's probably when the GoPro issue started. Cutting and planing the second set of strips also took about an hour. The sacrificial strips I glued on are to prevent the planer from exploding the ends of the strips, which will almost definitely happen to some degree since this time it's end grain that's being planed. And you can actually see that this happened to the sacrificial pieces in the time lapse if you pause the video. Prior to gluing up the second set of strips, I line up the strips so that the corners are as perfectly aligned as they can be, and then make a bunch of marks across all of the strips so that I have an easy reference during the glue up. I've pretty much always had corner alignment issues in the past, and I think this board has the best corner alignment so far. There are several factors that can cause the corner alignment to be bad, but I think this time around I finally realized what one of the biggest culprits is and how to mitigate it. I think that when I flatten the board after gluing the first set of strips together, it's important to try to shim the board on the flattening sled in a way that the top is as parallel to the bottom as possible. If the board isn't shimmed in this way, the original glue lines will not be perpendicular to the new flat surface, but the following cuts will be. So when you flip the strips to make the grid, the glue lines will be all over the place. I think this is a problem that's plagued me specifically and not others because not many people make chessboards out of 8/4 material, so the effects are really exaggerated for me. The second glue up takes about an hour and a half, and that's because of the way I do the glue up. In order to keep the strips from sliding around, I clamp them to the sheet of aluminum that they sit on. I could probably do this with all the pieces at once, but I don't want to risk the glue setting up on me before I get them all aligned and successfully clamped together, so I do this. I don't think you need or want to watch me glue each new strip on, so I'll just take this time to say that if you like my videos or just the things that I make, please consider liking and subscribing, but maybe more importantly, don't hesitate to leave feedback on my process or video editing or anything like that in the comments. I don't filter any comments and I have pretty thick skin, so remember you're on the internet and feel free to be harsh. For this glue up process, it took 7 hours of waiting and reclamping and then another 24 hours to wait for all of the glue to fully cure. So I decided to change gears and start on the chess pieces. To get the turning blanks out of the larger boards, I spent about an hour and a half mapping out the pieces on the larger boards. I try to minimize the amount of wasted wood and also account for the amount of wood lost to the bandsaw and miter saw blades. Then it's just a matter of making a bunch of cuts. Those cuts and this next step took a little over an hour. This next step is simply drilling holes into one side of all the piece blanks so that I can mount them on a screw chuck on my lathe. If you're like me, you're sitting there wondering how doing things like making 30-ish miter saw cuts and drilling 34 holes could possibly add up to over an hour. I'm not really sure. I do take my sweet time with making the miter saw cuts so they're nice and clean, but for a lot of these steps, I think there's other small things I'm doing in the shop which are related at that time. One example of those small things is finding center on all the piece blanks. It's another quick task, but I guess when you're dealing with 34 pieces, it adds up quick. For turning the chess pieces, I start by turning all of the blanks into cylinders whose diameter is close-ish to the largest diameter of that piece. I can do this quickly thanks to the little template that's mounted between the chess piece and the screw chuck. For example, the largest diameter of the pawns is about 22.5 millimeters, so that template has a shoulder cut to a diameter of 22.5 millimeters. This allows me to very quickly turn the cylinder down to be just over 22.5 millimeters just by looking at it. This of course means that I need a template for each unique chess piece though. Once the blanks are all cylinders, I turn them all to shape. For pretty much everything I do with the chess pieces, I work my way up by rank, so I start with pawns, then move on to rooks, knights, bishops, queens, and finally the kings. To get the chess pieces to be consistent is a bit of a challenge. In the past, I basically constantly stopped to measure things like the diameter of the top of the piece. I still do this, but now I do it a lot less thanks to storyboards. The storyboard is basically a piece of wood with markings and notches on it. The markings allow me to quickly mark and remark critical points on the pieces, like the location of the narrowest point, and the notches allow me to easily determine when I'm close to the final diameter of a certain area, like the narrowest point or the top of the chess piece. The storyboards gave me a bit too much confidence though. They changed how I approached turning the pieces and also prevented me from manually measuring to those critical points. This is important because even though the mark on the board is at the same point, the angle of the pencil can change, which results in the location of that critical point being off by a millimeter or more. This led to me remaking many more pieces than I would normally remake. I still use the storyboards, but I also now double check certain critical points when I'm closer to the final shape. The piece you just saw me turn was a pawn, which is about as simple as it gets. Next up is the rook, which is quite a bit more complex. There's a sharp curve that goes to a straight line, and to get that just right, I switch over to a rounded carbide cutter. I can do it without the rounded carbide cutter, but the diameter is basically perfect to make the process easy and consistent. The real tricky part of the rook is the indentation on the top. I use the rounded carbide cutter again for this, but I also need a steady rest to get the best results. Without the steady rest, the piece might lose its perfect concentricity, which will be very obvious in the end. Unfortunately, it looks like the crappy GoPro struck again because I can't find the video for the rest of the rook. So I'll just say that part of what makes the rook tricky is getting the depth of the indentation to be consistent. My way of doing this was to get one the way I wanted it and then use a small washer that fit halfway in the indentation and marked that halfway point. I then used the washer as an indicator for the remaining pieces. With that said, we can move on to the knight, which is by far the most complicated piece. The first step of the knight is to basically just make a ball. This seems simple enough, but other than the diameter and location of the ball, I struggle to get the ball to be perfectly consistent across all four knights. If they're inconsistent enough, then the knights, when compared to each other, will look off. Once the ball is turned, the remaining steps are fairly easy to execute, but stressful because you can pretty easily go too far with any of the steps and ruin the piece. The first of those steps is to hack off the sides of the ball with a bandsaw. To do this, I created a simple little jig to hold and support the piece. That same jig is used for the remaining steps. The next step is to sand those newly cut sides to their final dimensions. I do this at the oscillating belt sander. This is another step that seems super easy, but the sides are tapered, and if they're not sanded to exactly the same point, then the lower end of the taper will be higher on one side than on the other. So I get really close to the final dimensions with the oscillating belt sander and then finish it off by hand. The next couple steps are done with a rotary tool, and it's when the knight finally starts to look like a horse. These steps are also very stressful because I need to hold the sanding drum as perpendicular to the piece as possible, otherwise the features I'm carving out will look lopsided. The last step is to simply put the angle on the face of the horse. It's a simple step, but again, it's really easy to go too far, and it's really hard to make sure all four knights have all of the points in the same location. I realize now that you probably want to see the results of these steps prior to the end of the video, so here's a quick clip sort of highlighting the results of each step. With knights done, we can move on to the bishops. The bishops are about as easy as the pawns, however this clip does highlight my different and incorrect approach to shaping as a result of the storyboard usage that I referenced earlier. Instead of using a roughing gouge to remove material in a parabolic shape, I used the parting tool to quickly get down to the rough diameter of the narrowest point. This resulted in a curvature that just wasn't right, and it caused me to remake a couple bishops as well as several other pieces I did this way. The remaining step, or steps for the bishops, is to simply remove material at an angle on the bandsaw and then refine that on the oscillating belt sander. Like the knights, it is easy to remove too much material here, so I get really close to the final dimensions on the oscillating belt sander and then finish it off by hand. I don't have a video of these steps apparently, but they're basically identical to the bandsaw and belt sander steps of the Knight. And when I say I finish it off by hand, I mean that I put a piece of sandpaper on a perfectly flat surface and take that flat face of the chess piece to that sandpaper. Next up is the queen. For the most part, the queen is like a big pawn, so we're going through the first steps real quick. This is the tricky part of the queen. It's not too bad, but like a lot of other things, it's really easy to accidentally remove too much material too quickly. What I'm doing is simply making a necklace. It's a ring around the neck at the narrowest point of the queen. The idea is to make it stand out more as a queen rather than simply looking like a large pawn. This idea actually came from the person that ordered this particular board. In order to not mess this up, I stop and check with the calipers a lot. I want the necklace to be a certain height at a certain position with a certain diameter. It's also important that the piece tapers to a certain diameter above and below the necklace. The last step in the process is to make the necklace round. This is easy to do, but hard to replicate the exact curvature across all 4 queens. Now I'm finally working on the king. The trickiest part of the king is really just making sure that all of the points are consistent across all of the pieces. I'm not comfortable making a cross for the king's crown, so I make a sort of cone type shape. There's also a flat area beneath that, which I call the head. The overall height needs to be the same as the other king, but the starting point of the crown and the starting point of the head need to be basically identical as well. The narrowest point of all the pieces isn't super critical because it's just a curvature, but on features like this where it's a corner transition, it's a lot easier to see if it's not the same across like pieces. I think I finally have a good sanding process now. I sand the pieces on the lathe as much as I possibly can. To start, I mount the piece on its respective screw chuck interface thing and then sand through all of the grits. Once that's done, I part off the excess and sand the top of the piece and take that to a higher grit than the rest of the piece. To finish off the piece, I switch the screw chuck interface thing to one that has a much smaller diameter than the piece. I then utilize a tool I designed and had a friend 3D print. This tool goes in my drill and allows me to sand with the grain. While the lathe is running at its lowest speed, I move the sandpaper at a much higher speed across the piece. The sanding spindle in the drill ensures that the sanding scratches are in the direction of the grain, and the slow rotation of the lathe ensures I don't accidentally create any flat spots. The next step for the pieces is to just prepare the holes for the magnets. There's already a hole from the screw chuck, so it's just a matter of expanding the hole and getting it to the right depth. Next up is installing the magnets in the pieces. I use epoxy paste for this so that if there is a polarity mix-up where the pieces get inserted at the wrong depth somehow, I'll have time to correct it. I use epoxy paste rather than liquid epoxy because liquid epoxy would be messier and require the pieces be upside down while they cure. To try and make sure I get the depth and polarity correct, I utilize a magnet inside a block of wood. The magnet is oriented just like they will be in the chessboard, so I get a single magnet on the block of wood but attracted to the magnet inside. I get some epoxy paste in the hole and then press the piece down onto the magnet until it's flush with the bottom surface of the piece. I'm skipping the finishing step because that's not really easy to show, it's not super entertaining, and this is already a long video as it is. So the next step you get to see is the flocking on the bottom of the pieces. I used to flock the pieces with actual flocking powder and never loved the results, but my girlfriend got herself a little X-Tool laser, so this time I'm using flocking backed paper and utilizing the laser to perfectly cut each flocked piece to match each chess piece. The first step you saw was me getting an average diameter of the base of a piece. I then add about 1/4 of a millimeter to that measurement and input that into X-Tool and adjust the flocking paper to the best spot in the device face down. I do it face down because the laser seems to angle from a single point, which results in tapered cuts. That's also why I'm cutting one at a time rather than 10 or however many will fit all at once. All that's left is the really annoying task of peeling the backing off the flocking paper and sticking it in exactly the right spot on the chess piece. That's pretty much it for the chess pieces, so we can go ahead and get back to the board now. The last thing I did with the chessboard was reorient the strips and glue them up to complete the chessboard grid. So now I'm carefully lining up the board on the crosscut sled and removing the excess material that was used for the planer. The next step is to glue the board to some 3/4 inch plywood. The idea is to help prevent the board from warping too much, but I'm not really sure how effective that is on a board that's this thick. Anyway, what I'm doing here is drilling some screws through the plywood into the board. I'm only putting them about 1/8 of an inch into the board so that there's no risk of those holes becoming exposed during power carving. The purpose of the screws is to keep the plywood from sliding around during the glue up. Once the glue cures, the screws can be removed. This is the first time I've used this method with screws for the glue up, and I'm so glad I did. It worked like magic. In all the YouTube videos I watch, everyone says applying finish is their favorite part of pretty much any project. I understand they think that way because it really makes the wood pop, but I struggle with finish so much most of the time that I really hate that process. This is my favorite part of the project. Well, for this particular project. I'm power carving the terrain, and this is what makes my chessboards unique. As far as I can tell, I'm the first person, and at the moment, the only person to make a chessboard with an intentionally non-flat surface that also has the spaces smoothly flow into each other. There's plenty out there with a similar idea, but the spaces are all just flat blocks of wood that are separate from each other. So this is when the project really comes to life and differentiates itself from all of the other chessboards out there. Heck, it even differentiates itself from the other Battlefield chessboards I've made because it's not the same terrain as other boards I've made. That's another thing I love about this concept. The different terrains you can make aren't exactly unlimited because even with the magnets, the angle of the spaces relative to each other still need to be oriented in a way that the king's heads won't bump into each other at any given set of spaces. However, there are still a lot of cool possibilities. There's not a lot to talk about for the actual power carving, but there are two things I did to help me succeed. Both of them involved Fusion. I designed the terrain for this board using Fusion 360, so the first thing I did to help me succeed was to print out templates of the side profile for all four sides and glue them on. This allowed me to pretty easily get the edges of the board to where I wanted them. In hindsight, even though I just used tacky glue, gluing the templates on was a mistake. Next time I'll just use tape. More on that later. The second thing I did was get the Fusion app on my phone so that I could easily and constantly reference the design. At this point in the power carving, I needed to do a lot more stopping and referencing the Fusion design, so I stopped recording, which means we can move on to sanding. For the sanding steps, I utilize a sanding pad on a drill with 60 grit sandpaper to refine the terrain. Once I get the terrain to where I think I want it, I'll go over the entire thing with 80 or 120 grit sandpaper to get it all smooth-ish. Once it's all smoothish, I do a lot of feeling and touch-up sanding. I feel for spots that are lumpy or just don't feel like they flow with what the terrain should be doing. This process takes a while because every time I think I got all the spots, I feel again and find another spot or four that need to be adjusted. Another thing I'm doing at the same time is taking two kings and checking them on all the spaces to make sure that the tops don't bump into each other. I also need to make sure that each space is flat enough that the bottoms of the pieces don't have an air gap between themselves and the wood. If they did, the magnet attraction wouldn't be a consistent strength throughout the board. Once I'm satisfied with all aspects of the terrain, I sand the entire surface to 120 by hand. On a board that is less random like a simple valley board, I could probably get away with using a 3-inch orbital sander, but for this one, it had to be sanded by hand. I wait until later in the project to do the remaining sanding, but I don't think there's any need to show you that, so I'll just tell you now that all the sanding took something like 8.5 hours. My god, that's probably high by an hour or so, because each time I would go out and sand, I would round to the nearest 15 minutes or so, but anyway you slice it, it takes a long time. The next step is pretty tedious, but it's at least clean, so I can do it inside on the couch with some TV in the background. What I'm doing is marking the center of each space on the board. This is part of what's going to allow me to have the magnets hidden in the board but still be centered in each space. This took about half an hour, and the next step that I didn't record also took about half an hour. That next step is just using some low temp pot glue to glue some plastic pieces on the center of each space. The reason why will make sense in the next step. That next step is drilling the holes for the magnets. To do this, I position the center of each space on the pilot point of a drill bit, and then with the drill bit that's in the drill press, I drill through the bottom of the board until the drill bit is about 3/16 of an inch from the outer drill bit's cutters. That pilot point on the bottom drill bit is what the plastic is for. The plastic is meant to protect the wood from that pilot point. However, the plastic I used isn't quite sturdy enough, so the drill bit did actually poke the wood, which required a fair amount of additional sanding. Anyway, this setup basically guarantees that the magnet will be in the center of the space. The only variation will be its angle relative to the surface, but that doesn't really seem to be critical. The biggest problem with this process is that it's a pain to position the chessboard each time. Having a second person saves a lot of time, but if that second person isn't thrilled to be there, there could be a lot of movement as you're trying to position the board. Even if that second person were motionless though, it would still be a pain just getting your head under there and looking and positioning, and it's just a pain. So please let me know if you have any idea how to improve this process. Even though it is a hassle, it really only took about 30 minutes. This next step is another one of my favorites, and that's because it's installing the magnets. This allows me to get the chess pieces on there and see how it's really going to look. The process is pretty simple, but of course it's important to make sure you get the polarity correct. The following step is to insert some weather stripping into the hole to keep the magnets from falling out during the remaining steps. I do this rather than fill the hole with a dowel or epoxy or something so that I can triple check the polarity of the magnets in all spaces prior to sealing up the holes forever. If the polarity of any magnet isn't correct, I simply remove the weather stripping and flip the magnet. These two steps took just about 30 minutes. Once I'm satisfied the magnets are all correct, I mix up some epoxy paste, get it into the hole, then use the weather stripping for that hole to push it down into the magnet. This will permanently position the magnet, but the epoxy paste also gives me some more time to confirm the magnet's polarities again. Once that's all done, I squeeze some CA glue into the holes just as an extra precaution. These two steps take an hour or less. The next thing I did was cover the bottom of the board and all of the holes with some veneer. This video is already getting pretty long though, so I'm just showing the trimming of the veneer here. All of these veneer steps took about 45 minutes, excluding time spent on mistakes. Once the veneer is in place, I can add the border strips. I have to wait until after the veneer is on so that the border strips cover up the edge of the veneer. I utilize the chessboard as a template and cut them to be oversized so that I don't have to worry about perfectly placing them during the glue up. I glue on one strip at a time rather than two or all four because I want to give as much attention to the process as possible. If the clamps aren't positioned correctly, there could be gaps in the glue joint which would not look very good. Obviously the border all needs to be flush with the rest of the board, so this requires some trimming and additional sanding. This is the main reason I only sand to 120 grit on the surface after shipping the board. The way I've got the board set up to do the flush trimming is a bit odd, but I feel safer doing it this way than I would holding the router sideways with the board lying flat. The final modifications to the board, other than sanding and finishing, are adding on some corners to the border. You probably noticed that I didn't do miter joints for the border. The reason for that is that I don't really trust myself with miter joints on this kind of a frame, and I also just like the contrast of making the corners maple. The process for these is fairly simple. The only thing that's really critical is making sure the blocks you use are thick enough that once they're cut to be in line with everything else, they come to a point. I used to struggle cutting the excess off the corners, but this time I realized I could just add a spacer block between the board and the fence of the miter saw to make the cuts. It still requires a fair amount of hand sanding to be truly flush, but this method for removing the bulk of the excess is much less stressful. All of the border steps, including gluing up, trimming, sanding, all that stuff, takes just about 3 hours. I didn't record all of the finishing steps, but the process was basically slap on a coat of polyurethane, wait a day, slap on another coat, wait another day, very gently smooth the surface with 4/0 steel wool, apply another coat, and realize the steel wool didn't make the surface smooth enough, so wait another day, very gently wet sand with a 600 grit foam pad, and finally add one final coat. The finishing process took about 2 hours, and altogether the entire build took something like 53 hours. The total cost, excluding mistakes, was roughly $230. That puts my hourly wage at just over $4 per hour. Kinda sad, but it's a hobby, and I want to make sure I don't price them so high that no one's willing to buy them, because then I wouldn't really be able to make them. Anyway, this is the final product. I think it looks pretty darn good. Please let me know what you think.